if there's a switch, it was mine.
Okay, I got this one.
I would. Yeah, I have mine.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
great. So yeah,
This one. Look at you ready to
Thank
I'm
you.
back already.
All right. We'll call the Administration and Finance Committee to order, and all 5 members are present. And item 1 is first an announcement that we will be going into closed session later on in this meeting for the purpose of discussing collective bargaining matters with the police union and evaluation of data of public employees. And can I have a motion for approval of the minutes as listed in our agenda?
So moved.
Second. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Item E2 is an appearance by Brian Grunwald, a partner with Schenck. Brian, come on forward. Have a seat.
Thanks for having me here this evening.
Yeah, thanks for coming, and I'll just leave it to you. Please tell us about the audit and any concerns that you have in particular.
Okay, sounds good. First off, thanks for having me, and I do want to thank Peggy and the rest of the staff here. I mean, in terms of the level of preparation and cooperation that we received throughout the audit process, certainly went very smoothly from my perspective. And I was involved with this a little bit last year as part of Tom Carmen's transition, but I think that went pretty well from my perspective as well, too. In terms of the discussion tonight, I think you have the management communication letter. I'm going to walk through that briefly, and then also the comprehensive annual financial report. I just have a couple of comments on that. If anyone has any other topics or questions or things you'd like me to go through, please feel free to ask. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to shift over to the management communication letter. And if you just flip to the table of contents real briefly, that starts out with a communication to the city. That's essentially a letter. The language that's included in that is pretty standardized. It's got a lot of accounting terminology. It's pretty consistent with what you've seen in the past. I have just a couple brief highlights on that. There's summary financial information, just a couple things that we wanted to highlight financially. And then last but not least, you'll see the comments and observations, just a few things we wanted to share with the city. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to jump ahead to the letter. And if you turn to page 1, and I'm just going to touch on a few of these captions. So if you see anything else that catches your interest, please let me know. On the bottom of page 1, you'll see the caption for significant audit findings in consideration of internal control and then financial statements. From an audit perspective, we always consider the organization's internal control structure. Essentially, we look at how things are done financially. How do you pay your bills? How do you process your payroll, for example? How do you handle cash? That discussion carries over onto page 2. And I'm happy to report that there are no, what I'm going to refer to as findings presented here. If there was anything that would stick out that we would be required to communicate, it would be referenced in this letter. Since there's nothing there, again, happy to report that there are no findings or concerns from an internal control perspective. And moving on to the middle of page 2, you'll see the reference to federal and state awards. That section of the letter focuses on compliance. Because of the federal and state aid that you receive, we do test compliance. Again, happy to report that there's nothing from a compliance perspective. Again, so I think you're doing things the right way with the federal and state money that you receive. So again, should provide some assurance to the taxpayers as well. But just want to emphasize those items. Again, the rest of this letter focuses on things like accounting practices, accounting estimates, corrected and uncorrected misstatements is one on the next page. That's all pretty standardized language. Again, if there's anything that sticks out there you want me to talk about, I'd be more than happy to. From my perspective, I'd say nothing unusual, certainly nothing that I consider to be a red flag, anything like that. Any thoughts, comments, questions on that letter? Okay. There is one other comment there, I guess, corrected and uncorrected misstatements. That deals with adjustments as part of the audit process. All adjustments that I'm aware of are included in your comprehensive annual financial report. So I do believe that is complete and accurate. Just want to highlight that. Okay, then we'll move ahead to page 5. Page 5, we start getting into the summary financial information, and page 5 focuses on the fund balance and just for the general fund. I know there's a lot of lines on this page between page 5 and page 6. I'm just going to talk about a few of them, but again, if you have questions, let me know. The first set of subtotals near the bottom of that table, your total for your general fund, your fund balance reserves at the end of 2016 were approximately $42.2 million. They did increase just over $3 million during the year. And at the end of 2017, you can see they're at $45,210,000. So you did have a strong year from a budgetary perspective in looking at your budget to actual results, particularly due to your spending and being under budget in several categories, including general government, public safety, public works. So that's really the primary reason for the increase in your overall fund balance reserves. There's a lot of categories there. The one I'm going to focus on first is the last line in that section. It's labeled as the unassigned. You can see you're at 11,485,000. That is up from 8 million from the previous year. That unassigned category, that's the amount that's really available for working capital and contingency reserves. From a benchmarking perspective, we always like to compare that to the amount of expenditures flowing through your general fund budget. When I do that, you're at about 21.3% for the year. So that's certainly a very strong balance. From a benchmarking comparison, 15% is considered to be a real strong balance by things like, bond rating agencies, and at the national level, the Government Finance Officers Association. When you start getting into that 15 to 20% range, you're certainly at a very, very strong balance there. So just want to point that out, I emphasize that. Then if I just regroup and go back to the top, you do see things there in that non-spendable category at the top, primarily the long-term receivables. That is really there because of some of the amounts that the general fund has advanced to other funds, money to the water utility, money to the TIF districts. So because of that, we try to identify that and quantify that, and just, again, it's non-spendable because you don't really have the money in your general fund until those other funds repay the general fund. So that's why that's presented there. Then the other section where you see a lot of lines listed there is that assigned category. I always like to call that your planning opportunity section. You can see you've gone through and assigned or earmarked funds for a lot of different purposes. Your total there is about 20.2 million. So again, you've got a pretty strong balance in terms of your assigned categories. And just keep in mind that, again, those were planning opportunities, things that were set aside at certain points in time. You do have flexibility to move those funds around if need be, if a bigger project comes up, or your priorities change over time. Any questions or thoughts on that? Okay.
You're doing great. Keep on at it.
Exactly. Then moving on to page 6, again, a lot of lines and a lot of information here. I'm just going to jump to the subtotals. Your subtotal for your special revenue funds, you can see you're at 6.9 million. That is up from 4.6 million for the previous year. Some of that's increases in some of the balances. You can see some of the rehab loan balances, the library endowment, for example, some of those increasing. And there's also some new funds, as well as some funds that are broken out historically, like the police grants amount there for 860. That was an amount that historically had been included in your general fund. So just a reclassification on that. And again, those items are restricted or committed for those specific purposes. And then the last section there focuses on your capital projects funds. You can see at the end of 16, you had a deficit of about 6.4 million versus a deficit of about 4.8 million in total at the end of 2017. Couple lines that stick out to me: that Public Works Improvement Fund. You can see you are at a deficit there. There is a comment and a little narrative at the bottom of page 6. And that's one that I would focus on from a budgetary perspective, and just focus on the timing. How are you spending money? How much is flowing through that fund versus the revenue sources and how you're financing that? Some of that's coming from assessments, which, naturally there's a lag in terms of when those assessment dollars come in. And then another one that sticks out is your capital accumulation fund. That's the fourth line from the bottom. That's up to approximately 3.2 million, up from 2.2 million for the previous year. So you do have some resources set aside there for capital purposes. And then when I look at the TIDs, I'm just kind of going to lump these together here. Whenever I look at the balances in TIDs, I just think it's important to understand the life cycle and where those are at. So I always like to look at the termination year in terms of when you're required to close those. For example, you have deficits for 14 and 15, but those are relatively new. The life on those actually goes out till 2041. So as designed by statute, you've got a long time to recover on those. And you've also taken advantage of some planning opportunities, because I know you're shifting increment from 7 to 5, and 5 is your oldest one that closes in 2023. So this is just giving you a snapshot of the fund balance at the end of the year. TID 5, you can see, went from a deficit of 3.3 to 1 million, primarily due to some of that increment sharing and the planning opportunities that you've taken advantage of.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, go ahead.
the library endowment, is that the Irv Turchek Fund?
That's
Yeah, it is.
It is? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And that went up, why, interest?
Yeah, it's just the volume going through that fund, interest, I think was there some additional contributions in that as well?
I don't believe there was an additional contribution.
Not in the Turchik fund, but we have gotten some other contributions there.
Right.
So that's more than just the Turchik fund, I think, isn't it? The library and, we got a,
No, that's just that
Yeah,
one
is it?
fund.
Went up, yeah, like
Quite a bit.
200.
Well, I think that was
They
the
don't
stock market.
spend- They don't, I was gonna say, they don't spend a lot, so
Yes.
there were a lot of interest income
yeah.
dollars in
Yeah.
there as
But
well.
yeah, was quite a jump, a good jump.
Seen rates coming back up.
Not that
That's
big.
almost about 10%.
There are some smaller other miscellaneous special revenue funds for those smaller donations
Oh,
that
okay.
you're speaking of for the library.
Okay, then just jumping ahead to page 7. Page 7 is just giving a snapshot of your water utility. Now, whenever I look at the water utility, it's certainly important to look at the operating results. That gives you a snapshot of what happened during the current year. But because of the way it's run and regulated by the Public Service Commission, I think it's also important to step back and look at your cash position in your cash flow. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of those items, operating income, and I'll come back and talk about the cash. From an operating perspective, you can see the operating income line about halfway down there. I mean, you did have a strong year in your operating income, coming up from about 1.6 million up to 2.6, primarily due to some fluctuation in your revenues and expenses. But now from a cash flow perspective, it's important to remember that you need that operating income because you've got to pay principal and interest. There's also a required utility payment that you're required to make to the general fund. And you're also using some of that to make capital asset purchases. So from a cash perspective, your cash balance at the end of both 2016 and 2017 has actually been zero. You've been borrowing money from other funds. At the end of 2016, you had borrowed 1.6 million. That actually increased up to 3.2 million. And really that's primarily due to some of your capital spending. You spent approximately 3.1 million on capital, and 1,750,000 of that was financed with debt. So the remainder is really being financed with money from your general fund. So that's one thing that we step back and look at your cash flow and your rate structure. What's happening right now is the Public Service Commission controls and regulates your utility rates. They do that based on your revenues and expenses. They also look at things like debt service and cash flow. They also look at your capital assets. They don't include interfund borrowing as a part of that formula. So right now, from a rate structure perspective, repayment of that interfund loan, in theory, really isn't built into your rate structure. So I'd say just, I know Peggy's real conscious of your rates, and I know you just had a rate increase, but just be conscious of that. And I think that's something that we should continue to focus on. Look at the budget, and I would focus on the budgeting of your capital assets and how those are financed, just because from a rate perspective, those aren't going to be built into your utility rates.
So you're saying that borrowing is hurting us in our rate structure? No.
Just the opposite.
Oh, okay. It's letting us keep our rates down,
So, no,
but the
what's happening is
PSC doesn't count that borrowing.
we're
Right.
not borrowing. We're not borrowing. Basically, we're letting the fund run negative. So over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been like meter technology changes and different infrastructure changes through meters, hydrants, different things like that, that we haven't always went to the PSC and got authority for and built into the rates. So that's one part of it. The other part is we have, in more recent years, we have a lot of capital purchases that we're not borrowing for. We also have some leases, some long-term leases that are affecting that as well. So what we need to do is we just need to be more cognizant of what we're spending in the utility and make sure that we can fund it, because we have to get that interfund, it's not really a loan,
Right.
it's an interfund receivable to the general fund.
Right.
We need to get that down to zero.
Okay.
So I did use the term interfund loan. It's not a loan
it's
with the
not a loan.
bank, it's a
Yeah.
loan from your general fund.
Yeah, it's a loan from our fund.
Yeah,
No, I
exactly.
understood that.
Yeah,
So
so you're taking
that
advantage
does
of your
not
cash
count.
balances in
Yeah.
your general
That,
fund.
we can't build that into rates,
Right.
is what he's saying.
So I would say just be conscious of that, because that has gone up a little bit in the last couple of years. Okay, and then moving on to page 8, Just giving you a snapshot of the sewer utility. Again, would focus on those same items. From an operating income perspective, about halfway down that table, you do see a slight reduction in your operating income from 2.4 now at 1.8, primarily due to an increase in your operations and maintenance expenses. And from a cash flow perspective, your cash balance at the end of 2017 is about 1.9 million versus 2.9 at the end of 16. Again, if you get into the details of the statement of cash flows, you're using cash to reinvest into your capital assets. So as long as you've got that built into your budget and your capital, your long-term capital plan, you're fine. Just wanted to point that out and just make sure you understand that as part of the capital plan. Okay. Then just want to jump ahead to page 9 with the stormwater utility. Here too, from an operating perspective, real strong year from an operating perspective. Operating income is up to 1.9 million versus 1.1 for the previous year. From a cash perspective, your cash balances are up from 1.4 up to 1.8 million. So a strong increase in your cash balances. You can see some fluctuation in the commentary there where it talks about the fluctuation in your operation and maintenance expenses. But strong year there for the stormwater utility. And then on the bottom, the solid waste fund. If you look at that operating income / loss line about halfway down the solid waste section, you can see you had operating income of 303,000 for 2016. That is a loss with expenses exceeding your revenues for 2017.
Recycling carts?
Exactly.
One-time purchase.
Exactly. Yep. Right on.
One-time planned purchase.
Yep.
And totally worth it as
Yeah,
well.
and from a cash balance perspective there too, you've still got 3 million in cash in that fund as well. So
Wait, Mr. Chair, where would the income from the recycling go?
So the income from the monies we get back from the recycler,
Right.
those go into that fund as well. But the carts that we purchased.
Right, no, I know that was a big
Oh.
outlay.
Right, and there will be a revenue to cover that. But again, planned and the fund is doing
When does that
very
start
well.
showing up, that revenue?
We started getting it 2 weeks after we started.
Oh,
I mean, it's not
okay.
huge. It all depends on current recycling conditions.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting a few thousand every couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you.
okay, and then moving on to page 10. This just gets into that other comments and observations section. Just wanted to share a comment with regards to internal control and segregation of duties. Again, I just want to highlight and stress nothing. I'm not aware of any errors or any issues or concerns. I would describe this as opportunities for improvement and the opportunity to reevaluate how things are done just to maximize the effectiveness of your internal control structure. Think of it as making sure you've got a second set of eyes on every type of transaction, as well as not only doing a process but documenting who did it and documenting who did that review. So that's what a lot of these comments are driven towards. You can see references to payroll processing, journal entries, the purchasing cards. And then the last item there, the cross-training, that's just trying to, again, be proactive with regards to best practices and making sure that your people are cross-trained. So if you have a temporary leave situation or a resignation, that you've got people in place where if it's your payroll person, you can still pay your employees. So just cross-training, again, just trying to be a best practice and take advantage of that. So opportunities for improvement. Went through this in detail with Peggy, and we'll certainly follow up as part of next year's audit. Any questions or thoughts on any of that?
Did we make that one person who didn't sign their P card
I was just
policy?
gonna say this.
I saw that too.
Am I looking, was that you, Mike?
Wait, we get those?
No, I didn't.
I didn't.
And then on page 11, just an informational comment with regards to governmental accounting standard changes. There's been several standard changes recently. This is just focusing on one. It's a little bit more significant with regards to leases. Good news is we've got some time to evaluate that and talk about implementation on that because we're not required to implement until 2020. So, Governmental Accounting Standard Board continues to be busy. Okay, so that's it with the management letter. Any other thoughts or questions on that? Okay, then I just have a couple of comments on your CAFR. I just want to highlight page 12. Page 12 is your Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting. I just want to highlight that. I mean, that's something that you go through a voluntary process. It's been 19 years, so you've got a great streak going. So congratulations on that. And then financially, I just want to talk about your debt just a little bit. So if you can turn to page 66. As you can see, the table on 66 is labeled as long-term obligations, and it starts out with your governmental activities. At the top, if you see that total general obligation debt line, I'm just going to walk across the columns on that, but it was like to be conscious of what activity happened during the year. Did you issue debt? Did you repay debt? Just want to walk through that. So you can see at the beginning of the year, total long-term debt for your governmental activities only was 44,194,000. You issued 5.3 million, retired 6.8 million, leaving you with an ending balance of 42,668,000. And then if you go to the next section down, you'll see the business type activities. Again, similar format. If you jump ahead to the total general obligation debt line, you can see you were at 28 million, you issued 3.5, retired 3, and now you're at 28,471,000. So that's a snapshot of what happened. If you jump ahead to page 67, I always like to jump ahead and look at the table at the bottom of page 67, because this shows you, based on your current debt agreements, what you are scheduled to repay in terms of principal and interest. And one of the things bond rating agencies often do is look at your debt and your debt structure. If you look at the next 5 years of what you're scheduled to repay in terms of your principal, for your governmental activities, if you look at that principal column, you're scheduled to repay 27.5 million out of the 42.6 million, so 64%. That's a very strong repayment schedule. And then if you jump over to the total column, your total, you're scheduled to repay 41.9 million out of the total 71.1 million, which is about 59%. So again, I would say that's a very strong repayment schedule.
And that's good to have a strong repayment schedule,
Exactly.
as opposed to putting us in a bind that
Right.
we have to, oh gee, we have to pay
Right.
it back. No, we want to pay it back.
Yeah, if you think of some of the
Okay.
criticism at the federal level, it's, are you kicking the can down the road? How long are you stretching your debt out? Think of it like a mortgage. Typically you have a 30-year mortgage on your house. You can see that you're, doing much shorter than that. You're repaying relatively quickly. So certainly I think that's good. The conservative accountant in me says that's good.
Sure.
And then if you jump ahead to page 68, this gives you some perspective on, how much debt do we have? How do we compare and benchmark? This walks you through the statutory debt limitation and calculation. So based on the equalized value of the city, there's a line there labeled as general obligation debt limitation, 186 million. So that's the maximum amount you can have based on statute. You actually have just over about 71 million outstanding. That's about 38% of the total that you could have. Again, not encouraging you to take on more. I mean, I'm just saying from a benchmarking perspective, that's a low number. I mean, so you're controlling your debt. You don't have an excessive amount of debt out there. 38% is pretty low in comparison to some of the other communities that I work with.
I was gonna ask, does anybody go to 100?
Usually when you see real high balances, honestly, it's usually smaller towns and villages. Towns particularly struggle a little bit more with the road improvements and paying for roads.
Mm-hmm.
So if you see someone that is closer to that limitation, I'm gonna guess it's probably a town who's doing a bunch of road work, or maybe a village that isn't growing and expanding, where your equalized value is not going up real much. So,
But for a city our
Our
size
size.
that
Yeah.
has the age of infrastructure that we have, this is an unbelievable number.
yeah, it's a very strong.
Unbelievably good.
Good.
Correct.
Yeah. Good.
Okay, so that's all the comments that I had prepared, and maybe just a recap on that. From a fund balance perspective, I think you're in great shape. From a debt perspective, I think you're in great shape. So overall, I think a lot of good news financially.
Great. Any questions from the committee or anyone else?
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we've been living through like historic low interest rates, and I know you don't have a crystal ball. We're in a good position once inflation comes back, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a good position regardless, I get that. Should we be borrowing more now while rates are low?
I mean, that's again, where does the crystal ball come in?
Yeah.
I guess it's tough to predict where rates are now versus
Yeah.
where they're going to be. And again, what are your needs? Because you've also got, some significant cash balances and fund balance reserves too. So depending on the size of the project and what you're looking at, you could look at your fund balance, some of those assigned funds potentially. But yeah, that's the other consideration. If you do, I guess what I would do is I would look at your your long-term plan, 5 years out, 10 years out. Do you expect to borrow, and then, you know, how do you wanna try to plan for that?
Roads.
Certainly, I think, certainly what I'm seeing is construction costs are going up.
Well,
To do
that's the thing
roads
I'm
is
looking
going
at,
up
like,
significantly.
we have some old buildings that we've been talking about.
I mean, some of the stories you hear with people not being able to get contractors,
Yeah.
pricing on materials, difficulty getting things like cement. You know, so certainly construction is a little bit of a challenge.
And we're probably, that ship sailed already, cause it's all going to Foxconn, right?
Any further questions, concerns? All right. This is a communication. Can I have a motion to place on file?
Move to place on file.
Second.
A motion from Alderman May and a second from Alderman Weigel. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Have a good night.
And then, item 3 is a held item from before, a strategic plan update.
This put on file. Move to place on file.
Yeah,
Second.
thank you. And any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. Item 4, progress and recommendations regarding total benefit package and employee benefit committee.
This, just a brief update, we'll be having a meeting on Friday at 1:30. We're finalizing the recommendations to bring to the, council. Hopefully we'll have a draft of that, either at the last meeting in September next Tuesday, or, we'll have a final, possibly, policy for you to vote on in October sometime. So just been trying to get everything together for the last year of our discussions with the committee, so.
All right, thank you. Any discussion on that? All right, we don't have to take any action on that one. Then moving on, item H is a closed session. Please take notice that the Administration and Finance Committee of the City of West Allis will meet at approximately 6 p.m. at City Hall in West Allis to vote on a motion to convene in closed session at said time and place, to discuss collective bargaining matters with the police union, discuss performance evaluation data of public employees, and to take further action as may be necessary and appropriate with respect to such matters. A closed session is, for the above purposes, is authorized pursuant to the provisions of Wisconsin Statute Section 19.851C, E, and G.
Move to go into closed session.
We have a motion.
Second.
With a second.